I find demon films scary. Like I actually like Hereditary, terrifying.
Yeah, Hereditary is very scary. I couldn't watch the canonical scene. I made my boyfriend fast forward through it.
And part of it's, I think part of it's like the lore of it. Like I actually reading your book. I broke out my copy of Colin de Plancy's like Dictionnaire Infernal, right? To be like, oh yeah, Asmodeus, this guy, right? But like, so if they've got Paimon, some erstwhile grad student or occultist is getting paid to like add that type of world building stuff, which I appreciate. But I know a lot of people, in fact, I know some people who've written like horror movies, and they will oftentimes be like, I don't find this demon shit scary at all. Right. Mm-hmm. And more often than not, the people who are saying this are Jewish, right? Like this just doesn't have traction for me somehow, right? And I think there's only been one in recent memory.
I'm not afraid of demons, I have to say. It's not part of my,
There's only been one recent, to my knowledge, like demon attempt to like do an exorcist for Jewish audiences. And it's about this, there's a Dybbuk box, like supposedly it's an object. Yes. Have you seen this one?
I haven't seen this, but I both took a class on Yiddish literature and we read the Dybbuk in it.
Yeah.
And I am also converting to Judaism. And so I also like have been doing a lot of reading on like demons and Judaism just because of my own personal interest. And you're right. I do think it's like a weird crossover. There's like a very different idea of what demons are.
Welcome to the tribe. We don't really.
That's awesome.
We don't exorcise people.
You could do a much better version because
I'm going to do it.
My understanding of the film, right, which among other things is a vehicle for Modest Yahu's one attempt to act as a rabbi. Like literally, there's a quote unquote Dybbuk box, which apparently only exists because as an internet legend, because like someone was selling an object on eBay and said it was a Dybbuk box, and then this sort of, in this kind of Mandela effect, became a thing that people then believed, like you would actually put a Dybbuk in a box, whatever. It becomes the thing that possesses a young girl, and Modest Yahoo is literally a rapping rabbi who is, who does the kind of like the exorcist style thing. But it's a terrible movie is what I'm getting at here. Whereas I was thinking someone with your sophistication about writing about demons.
Too sure.
And now with the added element of the conversion thing, you could actually do it. You could execute a compelling.
Well, Asmodeus is in the Talmud.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's also, I mean, like, I do think the Talmud has these moments of sort of like demonology, but I do think like most people know of Asmodeus from a Catholic book of the Bible, from the book of Tobit, which is also not one that I grew up with. It's like, and in I think traditional U.S. evangelical Christianity, like Catholicism is considered almost demonic. Like there's this way that like where I grew up and the people I grew up with, like very much thought even like reading these other texts was not kosher, for lack of a better word. So I only read the book of Tobit much more recently. Yeah, but there are demons. I mean, like that's the thing that's so interesting is like you can dig into like a lot of these traditions, and even not that far. Like you don't have to go into Kabbalah to really get to the demons necessarily, but they're there in the corners.
I mean, there is something, and now I'm thinking about a lot of your writing about, looking at demons and demonology from an evangelical perspective is just so, it's so far outside of my, like, just kind of the set of references that I have access to. But the kind of twinning of the demon with the conversion therapist and the way that evokes this phrase that, I mean, I have been thinking about this ever since I read Herculine, that one of these phrases that's become like thoroughly ecumenical is like the sort of like, we all have our demons.
Yeah.
Right. And like why that's so sticky as an expression, and just, we don't necessarily go on in like that kind of common phrase to be like, these are things we have to exorcise. But like, of course the metaphor is there. And for you in this book to juxtapose these two things and then make us wonder about like who or what actually needs to be exorcised, like whether it's the figure of the therapist in a lot of ways, it just struck me as like
Yeah.
So beautifully done. I mean, painfully done, obviously.
Thank you.
But
if I could piggyback on that, maybe to tie a sort of, because this is what I was trying to sort of lay the groundwork for, and Abby, you just did it beautifully, right? Is on the one hand, I think we can agree that demons are back, right? In the
demons are back.
Demons are back.
Demons are so back.
Yeah.
Sort of like how Freud is back.
Yeah,
I was gonna say
the repressed demons have returned.
They're
they're doing very
back.
well electorally, but also too, like, and this is what I think the Evil show kind of exemplifies, like the idea of the demonic. Every generation kind of gets its own demons, or certain types of social suffering produces them, right?
Yeah.
Like the demon of AI or all that, like that's there. And even as like the purchase or like traction of like a Christian tradition, broadly speaking, may not make demons scary for Abby or other people coming from a different vector.
AI demons are scary to me.
They are scary,
yeah.
There is something, and I think this is what your book, among the many things it does so brilliantly, does. The status of the demons in this text as like both literal, but also reflecting some set of traumas, etc. We'll get into it, I know. Seems to draw on something that does have traction, certainly for Abby and me, and I think for a lot of other people, namely these kind of experiences of cumulative trauma, of demonization and scapegoating as like political and just sort of social processes, and like these logics of self-surveillance, disclosure, temptation, pleasure, guilt, and shame in ways that seem to produce things that like are in us or more than us, but that in any event are very real, even if they're not necessarily like physically present, or even if we don't have the same metaphysical systems warranting them.
In which context, exorcism seems actually like a kind of lovely fantasy that you could just be like, get behind me, Satan, and then.
Yeah, I mean, it's also sort of the fantasy of exercising the symptom, or of like getting rid of the, all of these things in a way that is clean cut and very, and I think a lot of the book too is sort of like you're saying, Patrick, I think like playing on these dialectics and sort of trying to approach them in a non-dialectical way. Like there's a way that, right, the book is ostensibly about demons haunting a group of trans women on a commune. Also, you could sort of say, there's the hell of the freelance world, or of trying to like make it in New York, and right, there's sort of the rural and the urban and the trans and the cis and the lesbian and the bisexuals and sort of all these different things. And I think that the way out ultimately isn't to sort of say, oh, I can exercise my trauma, or I can exercise my political beliefs, or I can exercise my, even family. I think there's a lot of these things where those things become really muddy. And I think like the sort of work in the book, and I think sometimes I have found some people to be frustrated by this, is not like an ultimate Buffy end of the world showdown, at least not in the way perhaps that people may come to the book expecting for a book about a commune that is haunted by demons, both literal and figurative. And it's not like the demons or the trauma gets solved, because those are not things that can be solved. They may be integrated, they may be worked on, but they're not even necessarily worked through. They're sort of I don't know. It's been interesting, I think, to talk about the book with people on tour, because some people sort of brought up Buddhism, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. That was purposeful. I don't think I talked about it in the book, and everyone was like, no, you did talk about Buddhism in the book, and I was like, oh, okay, right. But I also think there's a way that a lot of that was me also like working through and thinking about religion and about spirituality and about like, what are the limits of those things in the face of nationalism, in the face of scarcity, in the face of trauma. I think all that is on the nose.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so excited to introduce Grace Byron. Grace is a writer from the Midwest based in Queens. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Nation, Vogue, GQ, New York Magazine, and elsewhere. Her debut novel, Herculine, is out now from Simon & Schuster. And it is Herculine that we are here to discuss, but we're also going to get into some of Grace's other writing, including a piece that many listeners may have read in Parapraxis about conversion therapy. Grace, we love your work. We're so excited to have you on the show. Welcome to Ordinary Unhappiness.
I'm so excited to be here. I'm such a super fan, and yeah, it's just an honor.
So let's get into it. Can you tell folks a little bit about Herculine and about how you came to write it? I will say that I first came to know your work from reading your book reviews and your other criticism, but Herculine is your debut novel. Congratulations. So what is the origin story of the book?
Yeah, I think I've had a very strange career run in a lot of ways, but I originally sort of set out to write fiction, and I was sort of doing short stories that were not really getting anywhere. And a friend of mine, Erin Taylor, was like, do you want to do a book review? And so I started doing book reviews of novels. And that was really how I got into freelancing. And so I started doing book reviews, and then, that doesn't pay a lot. So then I did some journalism, which pays a little more, but not so much more. But the goal was always to sort of do novels. And I think I have found a love for nonfiction along the way. But for a while, I was like, okay, well, maybe I should write a memoir when I was like getting some nonfiction traction, which was a horrible idea. And I tried, and everybody who read it said, this is terrible. And it was sort of like a really bad Maggie Nelson impersonation of like fragments about Foucault and about diary writing as self-surveillance and Christianity and evangelicalism and exorcism and blah, blah, blah. And some of that ended up turning into like essays that I then published at places like Parapraxis or The Baffler or The Cut. But I think I ended up taking a fiction workshop, and I was writing, and I was just like, oh, I'm really angry. And this voice sort of like took over, and I realized this is what was missing, was like the ability to play with characters and sort of like do not a reparative, but like a very different reading of conversion therapy. And there's certainly some bits of my own life in the book, but I would not say it's like autofiction for obvious reasons. But I think that it reflected some of the frustrations that I had around the idea of the trans memoir, of trauma porn, of realism, which I still love, and who knows about what I may one day write next. But I think that the book sort of like almost condensed from what it couldn't be rather than like what it could be. And then I think slowly the voice took over, and demons sort of became a part of it. Like at first it was just sleep paralysis demons, and then it was, more demons sort of came in, and they just sort of kept haunting and taking over the book. They kind of had their own voice, and that sort of interplay between like how horrible trying to be a freelance writer in New York is, alongside like the kind of droll voice of these demons, like that sort of felt like it was the engine for how the book moved.
I in this kind of classically ADD coded way, like I'll get really into reading a certain body of literature for a period of time, generally to fall asleep. And so for about a year and a half now, it's been Western occultism, right? And reading all these studies and grimoires and ethnographies and memoirs and such like. And
I can't believe it puts you to sleep, but it does.
Well, some of it's very dry, right? And also a lot of it is, it involves like numbers. Like I was trying to figure out like the John D. Enochian system, and I'm like, oh, I could never do this because you got to do that grid with, and I just fuck up. Like if I can't.
There's a lot of lists. Like It's a lot of like so and so begot. Like it's almost in that sort of
And I was going through some of these like in the quote unquote Solomonic traditions, like all these like goetic, right? Inventories of different kinds of demons.
I don't know what that means.
It comes from the Greek word for like howling. Essentially, it's opposed to angelic, right? So you have all these different. You basically have all these names of different demons, and sometimes you get really cool diagrams of them, right? And they all have different abilities, right? I'm telling you, Grace, you already know this, but I'm just telling this to Abby and to the audience. Right? Part of the whole deal is like there's a real bureaucracy to it. Like this one is the lord of 15 legions in hell, and he's responsible for this cardinal direction, and he's a prince.
Sounds like the military.
Yes, it is. It's
very
also
much so.
There's an aristocracy too, but they'll help you with certain things, and they have different. So, like if you are a mage or a wizard in the medieval, early modern world,
sure,
right?
As one was,
yeah, and this is a little bit different from like the cavorting with witches that would be like cavorting with demons that witches would get persecuted for in like the witch craze era, but like this is like ritual magic. You would tap them, and they would give you certain skills, right? Much as in Herculine, they deliver all sorts of things, including like book deals, which cracked me up. But going through these catalogs,
I mean, there are worse things you could sell your soul for, honestly.
Well, some of them are like, you learn to speak good language. You can speak many languages, or you become extremely seductive to the opposite sex or whoever it is you're seeking to, like, it's all very
to seduce.
Yeah. But then one of them that there's a lot of, a recurrent things, they'll help you find buried treasure. And as modernity goes on, you start having commentators be like, well, actually, they're not that good at that anymore because people got all the buried treasure. There's no more buried treasure left. And I was thinking about that, and only now making this connection between like the hell world of New York and the hell world of the commune, insofar as that something about our moment, like, well, if only there was a demon that I could summon to do a Faustian pact, right? And then I would be able to write these things, right? If only. It's like the idea of conjuring a demon to get a book deal, even that framing of it, right? It's not like eternal peace. It's not like oneness with God. It's not like incredible riches. It's you get a book deal and you have to pay back the advance if it doesn't sell, right? There's still that added element where like even Satan can only help you so far in the hustle economy.
Well, demons are certainly limited by bureaucracy, sort of, as you're saying. They have their own rules and laws, even if that, is sometimes unclear what they are. And certainly in Herculine, the rules of the game are never fully explored, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the book's sort of structure, and maybe also for listeners, it's helpful to sort of just say at the top, like in the first half, right, or not first half. I always say first half.
First section.
It's really not.
Yeah.
It's like 50 pages, which is like a good chunk of the book, but it's not, most of it. The unnamed protagonist is really struggling at life. Like she can't really keep a boyfriend, can't keep a job. Everything is just sort of falling apart around her. She has these sleep paralysis demons that she's been haunted by. And she has this ex named Ash who has started a commune in rural Indiana. And she's like, you're not making any traction in New York. You should just come back with me and it's going to be perfect. And you'll live in this sort of lesbian T for T separatist utopia where we live off the land and we provide for each other and it's great. And so then she goes to this commune and she, starts hooking up with her ex again in this sort of dubious situationship, and sort of realizes very quickly that all is not right on the commune. And of course, I think it's very clear from the marketing copy that the demons are going to play a bigger role and things will be ominous very quickly. And so the demons have a relationship to the trans women in this commune where ostensibly they enter into an alliance where the trans women become tethered to the demons and the demons can give them things if they're happy with them, such as sort of surgery or book deals, as Patrick is saying, or, power, fame, etc. And the exact situation and who has how much autonomy is sort of a big question in the book, and sort of a big reveal potentially towards the end as well. But yeah, I think that is sort of the framing of how these sort of deals and bureaucracy come about, and sort of like the demons also have to kind of have a quota that's like kind of unclear what that quota means or what the quota is. And who is sort of at the top of that pyramid is also a question.
I wanted to mirror back to you something that you said now that I also really appreciated in the book itself, right? And I think this bears on the question of like how to situate this book genre-wise, right? As literary fiction or as opposed to nonfiction / autofiction, right? How it's constructed. And a salient feature, which I can imagine some readers, as you say, being frustrated by, but also I think makes a profound point, is that it doesn't deliver what a lot of like, say, like fantasy fiction would, which is like a very clear, consistent system of like rules. Like, how does the magic work? What exactly is the character of these demons? And or like how, you know, you don't get that very elaborate like cosmology. Yeah. But also even like I'm thinking about some of the fantasy novels that I've enjoyed where it's like there are different schools of magic and they work on different elements. Like it instead, and I think very productively, you get a vision of, or you provide a vision of a world in which everyone is trying, and there definitely is bureaucracy, and there definitely are limits, but how exactly things are going to shape out remains extremely unclear. There's like a precarity and anxiety. Yes. Everyone wants things, but they don't necessarily know if they're going to get them or what it means to get them. And everyone is thus kind of like both operating out of desire and love too, but maybe they're using one another or maybe they're being used. And it's a fantastic choice to resist that conceit. And I think that does something on a genre level that's really interesting.
That's so interesting. I hadn't thought of it in relation to the genre question, but I do think it's important and interesting to interrogate the sort of genre question, because I both have these sort of conflicting feelings about it, because on the one hand I think, well, there's nothing wrong with genre, and my favorite writer is Ursula K. Le Guin, and I think she was a very staunch defender of genre and its ability to move through the world, and she has a very, you know, a lot of very funny jokes about the way that genre gets demeaned and like who gets to write where based on those things, etc. And at the same time, I think she wrote in many different traditions. I think she just sort of wanted genre to be respected, and at the same time I'm very acutely aware of how genre, especially genre by minorities, moves in the market and gets situated and gets demeaned, blah, blah, blah. So to me, I'm sort of like, well, it's like literary, you know, genre fiction, whatever. And I always had sort of seen it in like the sort of like Kelly Link, Carmen Mercado, Le Guin sort of style. And I think that it has sometimes been too genre for the literary people and too literary for the genre people. And that's just something that I'm just like, well, that's what it is. Because I don't know, I didn't really write it setting out to be like, this is going to be a proper genre novel or whatever. It's just like, this is the novel that I have in me. This is the novel that I have to write. And I think that everything you're saying is like exactly why that happened. Like, it is chaotic and it is precarious. Like, that was sort of the whole point of the book, was to sort of interrogate these ideas about what precarity mean, and also about alliance and community mean, and the way that sort of like, there's sort of this way that the T for T commune is sort of a cautionary tale, not because it's T for T, which I think can be very powerful and has been and is, but because sometimes when you go into that situation and you don't work on having solidarity, and it's a very individualistic, and it can be very individualistic. That's the problem, is when you go in sort of naively or as an individual thinking, well, this is going to be great. We don't need to do the hard work of building solidarity. We can just go in and everything's going to be great because we're the same identity. And that to me is, I think, like a kind of narcissistic or individualistic thinking that is not sort of communally minded, but sort of has this like queer mythology of going back to the land and everything will be better, which I think is a really dangerous fantasy. And I think often is something that I think a lot of white, queer, and trans people have, where they don't have to do a lot of intergenerational thinking. They, you know, and there's not as much like mothering going on, which I think is also like a key thing about this book, is that it very much is focused on thinking about a certain kind of dangerous thinking that happens in white trans communities. That's very tabula rasa, like we're reinventing the wheel, we're going to try this thing, and then it falls apart because, you know, when you make a commune, you bring all the same things from the outside world. You bring your baggage, you bring your trauma, and your trauma can really either use you or you can be used by it, or you can use it. And I think that a lot of these girls, for most of the book, are being used by their trauma. And some of them use their trauma, but not for good reasons. And some of them use their trauma for good reasons. And there's like, right, like you're saying, like all these sort of sticky things about how hurt happens and how hurt sort of moves as a currency.
You know, it's interesting when I think about just the very idea of a commune. I think there's some sort of nostalgia in there for a time that never was, or there's some sort of like sentimental impulse. And one of the things I really appreciate about this book is how like resolutely unsentimental it is in a lot of ways. But I really want to get to the commune of it all. And now also, I have to, now knowing from you about one of the projects that preceded this, like, of course it's Herculine, right? Given the nod to Foucault. I mean, not just to Foucault, but
yeah, yes.
but that's there. There's also the sort of like Herculean.
Yes, yeah.
So a lot of the book, as you said, takes place at this T4T commune, which is called Herculine in Indiana. And when I was reading this, I really went straight to thinking about the history of lesbian separatist movements and events. And specifically, I kind of couldn't help but think about the Michigan Women's Festival. And you all are only hearing me. You can't see what, but women with a Y, which, you know, explicitly excluded anyone but born women, again, with a Y, and really presaged what we now call TERFism. So to set this novel here is a bold choice with a lot of possibilities for interpretation, you know, not only to set a lot of this book in a Midwestern commune it's for trans women only. And two, it's really the kind of anti-utopian. There is a charismatic but problematic leader. Hijinks ensue. I think that's all I can say without, you know, spoilers. But so can you tell us about what you hope to explore by setting the novel in this kind of like trans separatist context?
Yeah, I think a lot of the book was exploring what not to do. Like, it's anyone coming for like a sort of political how-to guide to start a trans separatist utopia is going to be very disappointed. And, you know, I think that there are spaces that have worked, but there's also plenty of spaces where you find Reddit threads about accusations and things that have gone wrong and people holding power over other people, some in maybe catty ways, some in maybe really catastrophic and traumatic ways. And so I think I was really interested in sort of exploring kind of the illusions and fallacies of, well, let's just start our own thing and it'll work because we have this one thing in common and that will mean we have all these other things in common. When in reality, you know, it's still a stratified community, even sort of with these people who have often very similar identities. And there are always in the book, I think, these sort of bubbles of like, well, should we be only trans women? Like the narrator at one point is like realizing that her lover who started the commune, Ash, never really talks about trans guys. And she's like, well, what is that? And like, why are they not included in this? Right. And there's also moments where they're like, oh, most of the women here are white. Like, what's going on there? And there's sort of like all these holes that get poked at the project in and of itself. And I think I was interested also in exploring the cracks in solidarity or some of the threats to solidarity, like sort of things that can go wrong when you don't actually have the tools you need to build a proper community. And also, I think some of the ways that insularity and isolation can cause bitterness and can sort of like foil a larger, more material political project, which isn't to say that I think separatism is inherently wrong. It's just that I think at a certain point you do need to have multiple issues on your docket. You know, I think in a lot of my political writing, I've tried to link bodily autonomy to not just transness, but also to abortion and to immigration. Like these things are all really interconnected. And I think that there can be a sort of strand of trans exceptionalism that deprioritizes thinking about some of these other issues. And I think I sort of wanted to say, well, in this instance, it's transness, but it could be a lot of other things. Like it's not just trans utopian communes that are a symptom or a cause of like this sort of isolationist rhetoric. And certainly, I don't think the primary one. It's just like this is something that I have seen on a much lesser scale to some degree, where people are not making broader alliances and not like making connections and not, I think, reaching out, which I do think is important. And I think that I wanted to sort of use one example to point and make a broader argument that, you know, you have to reach out. I don't know, like reaching out across the aisle sounds so stupid because I'm not saying Democrats and Republicans should work together. I don't really, for instance, have much investment in that. But I do think that multiple causes on the left should be in community with each other and in relation to one another and showing up for each other. And I think that that is a really difficult thing to do. You know, I think sort of like the stranger can sort of like lend itself towards empathy or disgust, you know, in the sort of Levinas way. But I wanted to sort of think about that in a way that I knew how, which was through sort of exploding the idea of the trans commune, I guess.
There's a line that just like popped into my head while you were talking just now, Grace, from a June Jordan essay that is very much exploring the relationships between gender and race and class. And specifically, it's about like, how do we connect? Are these sort of axes of difference enough to connect? And there's this line, which, I mean, she answers that resoundingly in the negative in ways that I think play very nicely with what you're talking about. And the line is, when we get the monsters off our backs, we may all want to run in very different directions.
Absolutely. Exactly. And I think that is what happens in this book in some ways too, is and some people sort of want the monster on their back as a badge of honor too.
Yeah. I read that. I'm not sure where I'm going with this. I'm just thinking, but I read the review that was not just of Herculine, but of a couple other books, including Tori Peters' Stag Dance in New York Magazine, that was like looking at this sort of like, what is the cultural symptom that is, we have several books that have just come out now that involve this sort of fantasy of the, like, but not, again, not like nostalgic or sentimental fantasy of the trans commune. And I thought that was such an interesting, I mean, I thought it was a good review in general.
Yeah. Erin's a great writer.
Yeah. But there's still a fantasy that's at work there, right? I mean, and it's not just like Ash, the character Ash's kind of like delusional fantasy. You know, it seems very of our moment to think about, like, you know, in a political landscape that is trying to expel us, what if we self-expel?
I think it's really alluring and seductive to say, what if we just cut ourselves off from what's going on, rather than mobilize and organize and do the hard work inside of the what's already going on. And I get it. And I don't know if it's fair to begrudge people who do it if they do it successfully, but I also find myself very invested in the world as it is now and in these places. And also, I think, I don't know, I've been having a lot of conversations with trans people who are debating whether or not to flee the country, right? Which is not quite the same thing as starting a commune, you know, and in many ways it's very different. But I do think there's a question of like, when do you decide it's time to go? When do you decide it's time to sort of, you know, whether or not that's isolation or just like finding a different country to live in? Like, when do you decide and how do you do that? And what's your calculus? And I don't begrudge people who have left. I certainly get that. And I think the question is always like, well, not everyone can go. And so then what do you do with that? And I think that is like a really painful and difficult question. And I do think that, I don't think it's always escapist, but I do think we all have to sort of make that mental calculus for ourselves, and everyone has to sort of decide like where they feel like they need to best invest. And I think as long as you're investing somewhere, that is the important thing. And I think maybe like another sort of parallel to draw is that these people in the commune are not necessarily like de-investing from, you know, cis systems of oppression and you know, creating their own sort of thing. They are, but they're also sort of like caught up in their own bullshit. Like, it's not like they are then perhaps doing it and organizing in a different sort of mutual aid way. It sort of becomes this calamitous project that can't sort of think outside of its own narrowness.
I think this is a really difficult thing to talk about because and I appreciate the way in which you both have already been talking about it and the way that your book deals with it, because it's so hard to avoid sounding like you're telling individual people what to do, right? Or that, like, you know better. And I don't think that's what any of us are doing here, but I was thinking about this in relation to two things. One, like, you know, I guess the book dramatizes, this is a community where, well, you know, the leader, Ash, is still doing like software work, like fintech of some kind, right? And part of how the among the other, like, I guess call them cottage industries that are, you know, they're getting currency with, is like they're doing like cam girl work or like online like sex work, and those scenes are also not the scenes in which the porn is being filmed. They're not exactly like joyful either. Like there's a lot of difficulty in terms of like, how does this space that is separate still necessarily involve like just like financial and professional connections to the outside world? But then there's also, I think, and this is a thing that the book dramatizes so well, and that is thematized in different modes by different characters, this question of how, like, and I think you're right to talk about it as a kind of fantasy of if we can separate, right, or if we can start anew, that doesn't mean that we won't also find ourselves like smuggling in things that are part of who we are or what we're coming with, right? And I think that, well, you have this lovely line as the narrator at some point says, how do we actually build a world in which vengeance is no longer needed? Why do we treat our friends like shit if community is one of our core values? I can't quite parse the difference between God, my conscience, and the cop in my own head, right? And this idea that, like, even in trying to create a utopian or any type of project, right, that's politically radical, you are still going to have, of necessity, some sort of familiarity with certain logics of power or certain like structuralized kinds of relations, right? And I the two examples here of this sub 2-point thing that come to mind is like, I know someone who like grew up in a lesbian separatist commune in the 70s, right? No men involved, and that completely fell apart apparently because of like domestic violence that was happening within this community. And this woman, when she described it, she's like, oh yeah, this is the Lacanian, like, you could have a phallus and there can be a patriarchy in an exclusively female environment. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so there's that type of thing. And then another element that is also part of the book, but something I've encountered in my own way doing the work I do on guns, right, is the idea of communities, whether separatist or in the metropole, arming themselves. I'm not normatively politically strategizing anything like that. May be necessary. I'm not telling anyone what to do, right? But there sometimes appears to be this kind of illusion where it's like, well, if we can just get guns and learn how to use them, then we can thrive, right? Or then we can be safe. And again, I'm not going to be very clear for anyone who's listening to this. I'm not telling anyone who's like,
you're not being politically prescriptive.
No, yeah, exactly.
Or individually.
And it would be, and I think that conflation would be, it would be grotesque to be like telling a trans person that they shouldn't carry if that's going to keep them safe. Like I don't have to walk in their shoes. I'm not going to tell them what to do, right? But it is the case, or it has been the case, that, well, like, particularly in the American context, the fantasy of just like me and the people I identify with, if we can just tool up and claim some land, then we will be safe. I mean, that's a classic like frontier template. It produces all sorts of patriarchal violence in its own right, and also can bring through like heightened additional types of vulnerability, right? Even also hyper added vulnerability from the state, which now will go after you because maybe you know, you're doing some ATF violation shit. But I think uniting all these is this kind of desire, and I love the way you're putting it. It's like a desire to be an individual, but also to find like a community of individuals rather than something that might traverse them. It's like, we're doing something new, and then something gets smuggled in, right? The demons, there are pacts with demons here somehow, or like the demons show up if you don't. I don't know. I'm sorry if it's not making a lot of sense here, but
no, it makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, and I think you're right. Like, those are the hard things to talk about. It's like, it's hard not to sound prescriptive when you're talking about these kinds of communities. And so, yeah, I guess I also want to be clear. Like, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying be careful. Here are the pitfalls that are like pretty known quantities. And I think that there are certainly long-standing historical anarchist projects that are extremely organized and extremely invested in solidarity. And I think like a big part of the book is like, what is the difference between community, individualism, and solidarity? And where can you find like space to overlap with those things? I think that's like quite difficult to do, to be an individual and not get lost in a group. And I think solidarity is kind of like, I am an individual. I have my responsibilities to the group. And also those two things can coexist. And I think that's like quite difficult. And I think the book is also really contrasting this sort of like hyper-competitive, very individualistic world of trans people in New York that the main character encounters. And also the fact that even there in this sort of like not amazing space, she does have a few friends who are like, you can crash on my couch, right? Like you can be my, like, you are my person, I will come and get you. And one of them does end up like coming back around in the novel to help the main character. And that is like a form of solidarity. And I think like there's also this way where it's like, well, the goal maybe could be perfection or utopia, but in reality, there is something lesser that is still that we can still reach towards, that is still important to reach towards, even if it is not like a fully quote unquote liberatory practice. Like there's still something that's worth doing, even if it isn't like this land kind of thing. And I think to your other point too of like about like the sort of land back project, it's really colonial, right? And and I think like there's a lot of real and indigenous critiques of these sort of like going back to the land and tradwives and whatever. Like you're saying, like there is like a sort of like Western expansion thing where these people are like buying land and doing these things, which is not to say, I mean, you know, and that is true of all of America. But I think that I think like these sort of utopian projects have a lot that you have to parse through. Like even just talking about it as people who are not starting one, we're already having to navigate a million different political minefields. All the more so if you start one.
I mean, one thing that I want to think about here, and maybe using some terms that are certainly important for psychoanalysis, not exclusively for psychoanalysis, but I see, Grace, you being preoccupied with autonomy and solidarity, the ways that those things can be like profoundly in tension, even though we don't have to see them as necessarily opposed, but that we experience them as opposed. And the language that I was thinking about as like, I don't know if I want to say like the task of therapy, but at least these are terms that help me, is like thinking about the need to be independent, right? You need to be a person that has projects. You need to be a person that has, you know, although you change over time, you have some sort of sense of continuity of selfhood, but you also have to be dependent, right? Like those are like, you have to be independent and you have to be dependent and you have to be able to be both of those things. And like, that's like part of what it is to be a human being. And that's tough.
Yeah.
That's tough just in the part where you're being dependent and it's, you know, you're just talking about like introjects, or you're just talking about like the individual making their way into being a person in the world. And then you throw other people into the mix. I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah. And you're inevitably going to hurt people, including, you know, yourself in that sort of like navigation of responsibility and autonomy and accountability. You know, I think all of those things are really brutal and painful. And I think that the narrator is really struggling to sort of like think through these things while also sort of in real time being forced to confront them in a you know, in this communal setting. Like how much is she willing to give up of her identity? And I think she sort of enters the commune really aggrieved and really bitter and sort of not ready to believe in the project, even though she wants to. You know, like I think like there's always a part of her that's like, well, what if it does work? Like what if this is like the great, you know, fantasy that I've always wanted, and me and Ash will get back together, and you know, the sort of illusion of getting back with the ex, and we'll have this great extended communal lesbian family, and we'll raise our younger trans kids or whatever, you know. And there's a lot there too, but I think that she ultimately, I think, really struggles to sort of like figure out how those different roles are valuable to her, and also things she has to like move through. And I don't think by the end of the book she's really figured out like, here's the recipe for community. I think she sort of instead is just starting the process of actually like deprogramming from sort of like the idea of like, I have to be a member of a cult or like a body of a group that subscribes to specific beliefs. And I think like there's also that element of the book where she's like navigating, oh, well, this commune is a little culty and they all have these things that they believe in and bow down to in a similar way and have rules in a similar way to Christianity, which is not to equate the two, but is to say like groupthink can be dangerous. I think we can all agree on that. And that it has its moments too, right? But it also, I think, can be really brutal if you're somebody who's like, I need to have my own way. And I think she is trying to navigate that while also trying to figure out, like, how can she detach from the religion that she grew up in? How can she detach from this narrative, this sort of like savior narrative, both in terms of like God, but also in terms of later on Ash in the book. And how can she sort of like move through these things in like a non-dualistic or not, or even like a dialectical way? And I think like those are really all these things you're saying. I think they're really difficult projects and are like lifelong projects. And so at the end of the book, it's not like, and now she's done it. She's a wholly integrated person,
Right.
but I do think she's made a step towards something, right? I don't know exactly what that is. It's not, somewhat of an individuation, somewhat of a idea about what her politics aren't, somewhat of an idea about her trauma and sort of like not letting that take over her, but still letting it live. It's not something like she can really close the book on, but it's also not something that she is staring at all day long. And I think that is sort of one of the tasks that is required of her.
Yeah, and I think this is a feature of the book too that is really, I think, profound and you're very uncompromising on, which is that the stakes of trying to find community or to navigate the promises or pitfalls of identity, they're not abstract and they're not as, let's call it like naive or simplistic as they might be. And here, this is where I want to make a point of distinction, right? Between, I don't know, like imagine like the separatist impulse that like, I don't know, like the Aryan nations had in like the 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to go up, we're just going to take over a couple islands, or like all of Idaho is going to become this new thing. Like this is, and then I think is what makes it so hard to talk about, but also so necessary, right? In the example in the book, but also I think the examples that we were probably invested in thinking about in solidarity with the three of us and as listeners, right? Are those of people who they're not seeking to like reconstitute a past glory that they were nostalgically, denied by the threatening other. These are people who have been marginalized and who have been truly on the bad end of some real disservice from institutions of, the church, of psychotherapy. In other words, for whom community itself is it's not a utopian abstraction. It's a matter of exigency and survival. And in a way that I think is not, and what I'm also trying to say here is like, it's not just about simply recapitulating the settler colonial project, right? It is literally like we are living in this world that is killing us, or that is almost intolerable for us to live. So of course we'd want to try something else elsewhere, but it's still going to be us doing it, and our own experiences of marginalization, but also the things which we have internalized, which may be part of us, are going to be, well, getting to that elsewhere is not a answer or solution. It just opens up new kinds of problems. And the movement is good, but that's the essence of it.
Yeah, well, it's just a door to another door, and I think one of the lines that I think about a lot in the book is like, choosing T for T is just choosing another kind of heartbreak. Which isn't to say it's also not, opens up to a lot of wonderful things and being known in a really important way. I am in a T for T relationship, you know what I mean? Like I clearly like have an investment in these things, but I also think that it's not like a be all end all of politics, right? It's just like you're opening a door, and now there are new wonderful things, new problems. And so I think if you're trying to create like a trans platform or utopia, okay, there are some, with anything, like there are going to be sort of inherent problems and stakes with that. But you now have to make a lot of choices very quickly that, if you make the wrong one, open you up to a lot of possible outcomes that are not great. And I think something also that I felt very interested in exploring is like, I've always been very interested in my fiction in exploring trans people who behave badly, partly because that's sometimes the work of fiction. Like this is not a political manifesto. This is not like why, this is not like a T for T manifesto or platform. There are those things. Everyone should read those things. And I think like those things are also like really valuable resources for why to do those things and how to do those things. But this is it is a work of fiction that I think is often read very politically, but it's mostly about the ways that trans people can also fuck up, like in a way that's like there's no use or need in pedestalizing any one group. There's no way that your identity is not a shield. Your identity is not like a be all end all. It's not collateral. It just sort of is one facet, and it's a starting point. But I think the problem is when it becomes an ending point. And so I think T for T is great. It's just I don't think it can be your only point on the map or on the horizon. And so I think that also felt important to sort of like explore like trans people behaving really poorly both to each other and to others in some cases in the book. And I think someone at one point pointed out and was like, oh, like I think this one character is like a villain. Like I've very rarely seen like a trans villain, because even a lot of trans that I have read, like this, yeah, they were talking about Ash. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of people say like in a lot of like trans that they have read, like the cis person is the villain. And in this book, that's not really the case, partly because there just aren't that many cis characters. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I feel complicated about calling Ash a pure villain. I also feel complicated about calling the demons like purely evil. I think perhaps they are like 70 to 90% of the way there. But I think that all of these things are much more fluid and complicated on purpose. And I think like the end of the book is not, for instance, the protagonist like killing a villain, but actually to me it feels more akin to Ursula Le Guin's The Wizard of Earthsea, where at the end of the book, Ged has to integrate with his shadow. Yeah. He doesn't kill his shadow. You cannot kill the bad person. You actually just have to like sit with them. And I think that is like a much more interesting and difficult project, is to sort of say, I'm not going to be perfect, but I still have to sort of get up and keep moving and sort of like live with these demons inside of me, not to put too fine of a point on it. But yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good moment for us to talk about the demons, because they are not just metaphorical. In Herculine, not just the kind that, send a lot of us to therapy or keep us awake at night. There's literal demons. And this unnamed narrator is plagued by them to the point that she carries around supplies for dealing with them, in the same way that you might like keep like your doubles of like your favorite lipstick in like multiple purses or something like that. Like you got to have like some like demon fighting supplies. Again, it kind of reminded me of Buffy in the very beginning, where like she like drops her stakes. It's like you got to have it in your purse, right? And in the specter of Christianity is everywhere, right? These are not like ecumenical demons. It's a book where we get a famous line from the New Testament in the original Aramaic. That line, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, like God, oh God, why have you forsaken me? So can we talk about the role of the demons, and also the lurking and possibly even demonic role of Christianity in Herculine?
Yeah. I think that doubling was really intentional. I think like the novel in a lot of ways like plays on doubles and sort of like spearing them and sort of tying them together and subverting them and playing on which one is happening at any given moment. Is Christianity the demon, or the demon's the demon, or, etc. But I think that for me, the mythology that I grew up with was Christianity. Like for some people, perhaps it would be, I don't know, like Greek myth, right? Or whatever, like that, like Percy Jackson, that has been done many, many times. But for me, like the thing that I grew up on was Christianity, was God, was like demonology to some degree. And so I had a familiarity, and like I took many, many Bible classes, and I, feel fairly versed in like Christianity and church history, and also sort of on the more spiritual side of things as well. And I have an interest. And I, also a few months before the book happened, I had done that piece on exorcisms in The Bachelor, so I'd also brushed up on stuff. And that sort of just like felt like the material. Like it felt really electric to sort of take those things that had been weaponized against me growing up and even now, like in the media, and sort of like use them back, or use them as like both like fictional material and also like for the rules of the book. Like what if trans people are demonic? Like, so what if they use the demons? Well, that's interesting. Let's pretend that could happen. What happens then? How does that like get complicated? And so that felt really interesting to play with, and sort of like both satirical and deadly serious in this way, where the demons are sort of a vessel for thinking about trauma, but they're also a vessel for thinking about power. And I sort of like stuck with that. I didn't end up, going into angels. That there are plenty of angels. Perhaps the next book will have angels. But this one, it felt very interesting to like not try to question whether or not God is real, right? The book never really quite goes there. There's a still voice at one point, but I would argue perhaps it's not God, perhaps it's something else. And so I think it felt interesting to sort of like really go into the grotesque and the body horror and the demons and bugs and all of these sort of tropes as a way to think about haunting, and as a way to think about what we're ready to give up and what we're willing to literally sacrifice at times. And I think it just felt fun. It felt sort of like perversely gleeful to be like moving demons around in this fictional way, in this kind of, Buffy the Vampire way, where she kind of can slay demons, but she's actually much, if she is going to become a demon hunter, she's quite early on in her career, because she has not gotten to Buffy's level of being able to sort of bounce around, and she does not have superpowers. But yeah, I think, and there's also a part in the book where the mythology that gets used is King Arthur, which I think to me feels very linked to using Christianity as myth, because so much of King Arthur is like the Christian romance is about like lust and gluttony and greed and the downfall and those things. So to me, those felt very linked, and it sort of made sense in this universe to be thinking about. Yeah, I mean, I think demons are just sort of an endlessly fascinating topic, and yeah, like have really pervaded culture, I think, especially recently, whether that's, in the music of Ethel Cain or Hereditary, or, that Demon Hunter anime show that every kid is watching right now that I don't know the name of. It's just
K-pop
sort of around.
Demon Hunters.
Yes. Yeah.
I haven't seen it. I
haven't seen it either, but people really
teenagers.
tell me about it, and I say thank you.
So we are a podcast about psychoanalysis, and so I need to ask about therapy, because it plays a really significant role in Herculine. It is not a happy idea or experience for most of this book, because the narrator has been through, I was trying to think of the right verb there, and I think it is like been through, like in the sense of like going through it, conversion therapy. And the conversion therapist actually haunts this novel. Like he actually becomes a demon at some point. I want to read, before I ask you to tell us a little bit about how you're writing and thinking about therapy, I want to read a passage that's pretty long, but I think it's important for when we're talking about a novel to read, for people to be able to have a sense of what it sounds like. This is from the first section, from before our narrator leaves Queens and goes back to Indiana, goes to Herculine. Conversion therapy was presented as a healing program. I would become whole again, washed clean in God's eyes. I would feel worthy. I would remember life was worth living. Loneliness would become obsolete, a magic bullet cure for a girl on the edge. The business of change is a tricky thing. So many want it so badly. For a while, I too believed I could change. I believed sexuality wasn't fixed. I could become an ex-gay. Freedom meant freedom from sin, not freedom to sin. Then later, in order to cope, I decided it was fixed, and that meant I was not a sinful gay, but a natural gay. Now, yet again, I'm less convinced sexuality is fixed. Why does it need to be? I can have my pussy and eat it too. I couldn't prove to anyone that my life would always be happy. I couldn't prove anything except that life could either be possibly worth living or not worth living at all. Some things just happen, and we're drawn toward them with the power of inevitability. Some girls I know talk about the process of starting hormones as if in a trance, continually saying they aren't sure, even as they Google doctors, watch YouTube videos, make appointments, take their first injections. It's not simply that the body knows before we do. The body can't act alone, though perhaps it can override our hesitation. We followed the hypnosis of need. Being a closeted teenage girl was hoping one day you too would have a pregnancy scare while driving your cis girlfriends to get Plan B. We hid our nocturnal activities from our parents, knowing the possible punishments that awaited us. We talked about escape and got high and sat down on the tennis courts at 3 a.m. All the books we read about teenagers made us think that our experiences with love would matter later on, that hurt could be overcome with language. We lived in the shadow of feminism's belief in talk therapy. So we talked. We figured we could work through anything with one another. We went on long walks around the neighborhood because we couldn't stand still. We told one another we would move and make something of ourselves. I tried to convince everyone over fruity wine that we had lives worth living, that movies about kids with fucked up brains were too romantic, even if they got one thing right. It did feel like life and death. When you get older, you forget that part. In high school, it felt urgent like a knife. It felt like everyone was only 2 steps away from the psych ward. Some of us did our stints. I could still remember setting off fireworks in baseball fields, staring at the waning moon, and walking home in a stupor. I don't think any of us had therapists, not real ones anyway, not until much later. How old do you have to be to confront your childhood? Close quote. Yeah, so there's so much there, but I pulled it because I really liked this passage, but also because it is one of the places in the novel where you're writing about therapy in a mode that is not only about conversion therapy, intersects with your writing about conversion therapy. And I did want to ask you to talk about how you write and think about therapy.
I think about therapy a lot. I on a personal level, I jokingly say I've done all of the kinds of therapy that there are. I've done EMDR, I've done internal family systems, I've obviously done CBT, I've done psychoanalysis, I've done somatic therapy, I've done conversion therapy. So Christian counseling, all these different things. And so I feel on some level, there's a joke in the book that's about I did all of the things so that I could relate to how Paul says that in one of his epistles. He's like, I did all things, God tempted me always, so that I could relate to all people. And I feel similarly about therapy, where I'm like, well, I've done them all. Yeah. So just tell me and I'll tell you what I thought of that one. But I think that there's something interesting about the different ways that therapy gets weaponized. I think in my piece for Prayer Practice, I sort of talked about the intersection between psychoanalysis and conversion therapy, especially in sort of early stages, and how there was kind of this unholy alliance between some psychoanalysts and the right about gender and sometimes sexuality as well. Which I think we're also very much seeing now with the so-called gender exploratory therapy, which is very much a method of just trying to stop kids from transitioning and just sort of just talk about it until you don't want to do it anymore, and instead of actually being a path to HRT. And what do I think about therapy? I mean, I think in the book, right, so much of the book is about just conversion therapy being just brutal, just being a sort of absolute clobber, and being this sort of and having this really long afterlife too. Because I think there's also in a lot of typical media about conversion therapy as sort of this thing that you experience when you're young and then you get over it. When in reality, I think it, for most people, increases anxiety, increases depression, potential for OCD, all of these sort of things. And I when I did psychoanalysis, I did find it to be very jarring in the way that there were some similarities to how conversion therapy felt, at least in a sort of somatic way, which I think is something that I've thought a lot more about now that I've done a lot more studying of psychoanalysis, and sort of have a very different take on now than I think when I was originally undergoing analysis. I never did the proper length of time. I kind of wimped out. But I think that there is this way that the narrator is thinking about how different versions of therapy in this passage have failed them. whether that's sort of like the traditional talk therapy, the sort of like way that I think a lot of like feminism in the 90s and early OOs was very pro like talk therapy as sort of a way of like getting out of your head and out of your troubles, when in reality I think it's like, well, that also doesn't account for the sort of like political ramifications of the world around you. And especially if you're in conversion therapy, only so much around you can stop that, or sort of like fix that or attenuate that. And yeah, I think that the bare praxis was sort of also me being like, well, let's look at it. Like, I underwent this thing. I'm very interested in like, how did it actually happen? I think I have that sort of perverse masochistic urge. Like when I transitioned, I also read a lot of TERFs and TERF theory, and I read like Mary Daly and Sanjanice Raymond, and I know Durkin is very controversial whether or not she was a TERF, but I also read a lot of Durkin. So I feel like I have this urge to be like, well, how did this happen? Like, how is this like a thing that's like, and how did it circulate? How is it moving? In a way that I'm almost like, I want to understand and master this thing in a way that you, person who did this to me, don't even understand yourself, which is such a fantasy of control. But I think that is part of it. And I think that the novel sort of refuses to do some of the work at the essays that I did. I think the novel really refuses to give a clear trauma timeline or a clear therapy timeline.
Yeah.
And that felt important, that it's not like a trauma porn memoir and things are redacted, things are put out of order, things are fragments. And so I think, but to me, that's also a way that I think about conversion therapy, is that it felt fragmented and my memories of it are very fragmented. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I find therapy to be this sort of like endlessly, I think my current therapy experience is so much more banal, but I have done like the wilder ones at different times. And I find them all very interesting to think about and write about.
I thought the parapraxis piece was really just outstanding. And one thing you say in it, which is a simple sentence in some way, but it says something that is, I think people struggle to say, let alone appreciate, namely, not all therapy is good. Not all therapy is open to any outcome. Right. And
yeah,
I think that's just, I just going to repeat that. Not all therapy is good. Not all therapy is open to any outcome. And I think that a lot of what we've said about, say, like utopian expectations or naivet about like, well, just using the right words or the right terms to identify a practice or just to tell the right story will ipso facto cure, right? Or like somehow you do this thing and the result is guaranteed, as opposed to it,
or you get better, right?
You get better per se, right?
Progress is involved in some sort of way.
And that progress is a necessarily like teleological improvement and applies here insofar as that, like with therapy, like stipulating, as you very compellingly make the case, that like there is a legacy of, say, like the insights of polymorphous perversity in psychoanalysis, inspiring a lot of homo and transphobic psychoanalysts to be like, okay, yeah, that means we can just make people straight, right? So like there is a kind of open-endedness to it.
Right. Again, anti-teleological.
Yeah.
Usable towards multiple different ends. Yeah.
But also, too, that it's the difficulty people have, I think, talking about this oftentimes manifests in proclaiming that, well, this actually isn't really therapy, right? And I think here about a conversation we had with Sophie Lewis, right, about sort of her accounts of feminism.
Where I was literally going to say,
like, okay, yes, a lot of these women who supported the Klan in the 1920s self-identified as feminists, but that's not real feminism. Right. And or turfist feminism is not feminism. And to be very clear, like, I am not like the decider in what does or doesn't get
You're
to
not
be
the
feminism.
arbiter of feminism.
Yeah, like I'm not, but also, and I'm deeply sympathetic to the idea that, like, okay, these are not good feminisms, right? Or like that these are bad, or these do not, those are not things that I would welcome in what I would like a feminism to be, or what I think is a feminism, right? But these are certainly, in terms of intellectual genealogy, in terms of explicit self-description, right? And in terms also of, I think, broader narratives about solidarity and identity that they mobilize or weaponize for worse in many cases, they should make people ask, well, what are my expectations, or what are our expectations of the work being done, or the work that could inevitably done versus the work that's actually being done, or the dangers that are being performed in a term, in a practice, in our faith in a movement, in an abstraction, over and against what, the actual fact that these are things that people do. And I think this again, like, not all therapy is good. Not all therapy is open to any outcome. And sometimes even the best therapy, the things we could all agree are therapy, they're going to leave the person who did the therapy still themselves, only more so. And they won't, haven't given them a new childhood, or a new sort of set of relationships in the world. It will just mean that they have to relate to those relationships differently going forward. Again, it's as you said, it's a door to another door at best.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of that too is about the relationship between, or the tension between dogma and practice, and sort of like, when do you give up dogma in order to be actually better at practicing? And I think like sometimes that is like how I feel about like Tea for Tea separatism, for instance. Like, when do you give up the dogma in order to have better practice? Which sounds so Buddhist, I'm realizing as I say it, but I do think it's sort of like a helpful like lens to think about this. Yeah. Because I think, and that applies, right, not just for that. I think like that applies to psychoanalysis, right, too, where you can sort of say, when does dogma get in the way of the practice? And I think a lot about Gender Without Identity, which I think is such a great book, or any sort of system, institution, and individuals, or not even just individuals, but groups, sort of, right? You could argue about like the church, right? Like, when does the church give up dogma in order to better serve, or better suit, or better be with, and better be in practice with mercy, or with other people who are maybe queer or trans, who want to be spiritual but are sort of blocked? And I think like that was a part of the book too, is like, you can do these things, but how do you give up dogma in order to do them? And that, I think, is a really, really difficult process to do, to sort of say like, there are rules, but rules maybe are meant to be broken sometimes in order to like be a better person. And I think like, I mean, I grew up in a church where people talked about Jesus breaking dogma in order to be a better Christian, but then, they turn around and do the opposite. And I think like that is a part of the book as well, is thinking through that, because I think I also didn't want to say all Christians are bad. And in the book, for instance, like there is one Christian, the narrator's grandma, who is like somebody who sort of is able to at times like navigate the difference between dogma, tradition, and acceptance and love. And while that grandma doesn't perhaps know that the narrator is trans, I think there is a moment of like reaching out across these chasms. And I think that is like a really important thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's something, and this is really, this is not a fully formed thought at all, but one of the things I really appreciate about the parapraxis piece is, it's a reckoning. It's a reckoning. And I know you also cite like Mackenzie Wark, for instance, on like the call for reparations from psychoanalysts on behalf of trans people, that it's a reckoning with the ways in which this tradition, this thing that we call psychoanalysis, has been so harmful in so many ways that will never be known, right? Because it happened for the most part under confidential circumstances in rooms where, the basic norm is that what happens in that room stays in the room, right? So we'll never know. We'll never know. But we also know quite a lot. And part of what you're doing is tracing like the convergence of psychoanalysis and conversion therapy, but also just like all, or at least a number of the ways in which this discipline and its practitioners have, instead of taking, for instance, the road that so many people like Avi and Anne do in Gender Without Identity, or Lucy Fielding, the author of Transsex, think about polymorphous perversity as something that is like a resource for thinking creatively about how to help people in a clinical space who are not straight who are not cis. So I feel like you find resources within that tradition, but you're also really not interested in letting the tradition off the hook. There's something happening here, I think, in Herculine with the same thing with the church, where you see, like, you're not willing to turn. I mean, I don't mean you, Grace, the book.
Yeah.
The writer, the person who wrote those. It is a lot harder to kind of tarry with the institution and the legacies than it is to just like peace out, to just be gone.
Yeah.
And that seems to me something that's you're doing here. You're working with that idea of what happens when you try to be gone, right? Like that is what is happening in the commune. But as a writer, and also the narrator is kind of tarrying in that way, which I find to be really admirable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think she's like, there was something potentially animating about religion that is like lost when she's at this commune. Like she's like, this commune has not quite figured out what idol or what practice they want to put in place of Christianity.
Yeah.
Or perhaps they have, but it's not like a good one. Like how do we find like a better centering practice? And while I think there are plenty of harmful legacies of Christianity that bleed into the left, I think that there are potentially also options or spaces for positive aspects of Christianity to bleed into the left. I think about like nuns who've done environmental work, or sort of like the Christian anarchist tradition, and right, like I think like these are still potentially really activating and powerful sources of caring for the poor or anti-imperialism or anti-war, these things that I think like are good. And I think it's just like important to not carve that entirely away. Like I think religion, I who knows what would have happened, right? Like if I had not gone through conversion therapy, perhaps I would still have a different relationship to organized religion or Christianity. But I don't condone, for instance, like saying all Christians are stupid, or like I just something that's like interesting or helpful politically to me, in the sort of like Richard Dawkins kind of way. Like I just think that's also pretty facile thinking to me. And so I think it's like, how do you hold all these really difficult contradictions about separatism, about the church, about psychoanalysis? I think those are, and while still moving forward and saying like all of these things still have really valuable political currency and also can be dangerous if left unchecked.
I feel like we've just made this sound like this like theological treatise, and I want to.
Oh, the book is hilarious. It's so funny.
I want to say also, the book is really fun to read. Yeah. Like I read it really quickly because it's really propulsive. So it's really fun to read, and it is also about it's about friendship. It's about community. It's about chosen family. But it's also a book about the limits of community and, about loneliness, about alienation, pain, trauma, dissociation, being out of your body, being out of your mind. So can you talk to us about how you as a writer go about representing these kinds of limit experiences?
I feel like the whole book on some level is this sort of balancing act or monologue. Like it's this narrator walking this really tight rope of how much do I want to spill? How much do I want to keep inside? How in my body in this scene or this moment am I? How real do the things going on around me feel to me in this moment? And I think to me, I think the thing that sort of like allowed it to congeal or to like work as a piece is like the fact like the voice is mostly, I think, pretty consistent. And I think like she is this kind of like disaffected, often disassociated or on drugs, kind of like stressed out, bitter, beleaguered, but trans woman who is kind of very over it, you know, and I think she's kind of like biting and resentful and tired, you know. I think kind of just like really like fed up with kind of like, she's the kind of person who say, I'm fed up with the bullshit kind of a person, like in that kind of Salinger tradition almost.
Yeah.
And I think like that voice was really important. Like to me, like it kind of had to be that, because that way she can sort of talk about trauma in a way that is not so pity me. You know, she doesn't really care if you pity her. She doesn't really care if you understand what happened to her in a linear way. And in actuality, I think she is kind of antagonistic towards the reader at times. And I think that she, in order to sort of like maintain for most of the book some semblance of self, she actually does need to disassociate in order to not fall into that like pit of despair that she is, I think, the whole book or most of the book, like walking over on a tightrope. And so to me, it is almost like this kind of like Fleabag like monologue where she's kind of like talking around all of the things that she doesn't want to talk about in order to, but also kind of trying to keep you engaged. Like in the same way that like Fleabag is kind of like looking and winking at the viewer and is like, look how funny I am, look how beautiful I am, while also being deeply sad. I think like there's something of that in this book too, where she's kind of like carrying you along and seducing you along. Like, look how fun this is, but also look how funny I can be about when it's not fun. And yeah, I think like that is almost like a kind of like thing of our generation, of like a way to talk about trauma where you don't have to do the sort of like earnest hand wringing or the cringe. I think that felt interesting to write about a person who really believes in that, like in a way that I don't think I do even, you know, like I'm probably a little bit more earnest than this person, but I think that this person is really invested in being this sort of like cool person, even when she is perhaps not all that cool. And I think that is sort of the narrative engine of the book, or the thing I could hang my hat on, was like her voice.
You know, I did have a few flashes. I don't think she's quite as cynical, but she reminded me occasionally of the Maria character in Imogen Binny's Nevada.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
who I love.
I love that book.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. No, I think she maybe is a cynical, just in a different direction at times. I think she maybe is a little bit less delusional than Maria.
Yes. Maybe
but
that's
I think
just a little more grounded.
Yeah. I think she's just as like fed up. But I think like her anger goes in a different direction than Maria's. Like I think Maria almost like creates these kind of like paranoid but also real fantasies. And I think like this character is a little bit more like, is using disassociation as like the vessel that she can like encase herself in. But I mean like I feel complicated about the idea of like trans literature as a body of work or as a genre, but I do think that there are many nods to other books by trans people in this, and like there is the sort of like brief but questionable like road trip that happens in this book, where like there's like one chapter where she's in like Pittsburgh, and like the book is segmented into two sections. Like all of that clearly is a nod to Imogen Binny's work, who is I think a genius. But I think it is like, it's not exactly like Nevada in many other ways, but there's just like this sort of like nod to that lineage.
I realize in our conversation we've explored sort of the political dimensions of the novel, or the questions that the novel raises or dramatizes, and we've emphasized also these really urgent and painful dimensions of human suffering and sort of different trajectories of marginalization via heteropatriarchal institutions, the church, right, the abuses and uses of therapy, etc. And I'm really glad we've had this conversation, because reading the book, and reading your other work, I really wanted to know what you think about these things. And part of, I think, the way we interview authors here is like, we want to interview the author with the book as sort of, it's first and center, but it's about like, how did you write this book, right? What does this book mean to you? And to talk to you about the issues that are animating your choice of writing the book in a way that would be different from like if you were just like selling the book per se. But also, I do want
other people should buy the book.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I do want to say the book is compulsively readable. There are moments in it that are absolutely hilarious. I was just howling with the descriptions of like New York literary culture and sort of like the sort of successful freelance girls and all these different headlines that like, like listicle style stuff. Like it's a beautiful send up of that. The characterizations and the sort of like the human drama, but also sort of like the sardonic kind of interactions between the women in the commune is amazing. So just like it's a compulsively readable, delightfully stylistically constructed, and really intellectually deep novel. And I really hope everyone listening to it just goes out and buys it. And I want to commend you for writing it. It was just great.
Thank you. That means truly, truly, truly so much. I really appreciate that.
Where can our listeners read more of you, whether it is pieces like the ones that we have referenced that might be really relevant to the concerns of our listeners, or also pieces that you are particularly proud of or recent and upcoming writing?
Yeah, I'm at Emo Trophy Wife on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram. And that's where I usually post things. The piece about the history of conversion therapy is in Parapraxis. The piece about the history of exorcisms is in The Baffler. I've written for The Baffler a number of times. I've been recently writing for The New Yorker about mostly trans politics, but also album reviews and things like that. There was a piece on trans gun rights in that, which perhaps is relevant, perhaps not so relevant. I do write a Substack, which is just gracebyron.substack.com. That's kind of where I put bits and odds and ends of things that don't quite end up anywhere else.
Also, I will put all of these things in the show notes so that people can come and find them. But Grace, I loved the book. It was really wonderful. I love reading your writing. Thank you so much for making the time to come talk with us.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is made possible and kept ad-free for everyone, completely thanks to the support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to support the show and get 2 additional episodes per month, including our journey through the standard edition and our pop culture episodes, please head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Grace Byron. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.